Good evening, and welcome to Cambridge Forum. Before the program begins, let me make some brief announcements. First, if you want to receive information about Cambridge Forum's future programs, please be sure to add your name to the mailing list on the table in the entryway where you came in. You can also find information there concerning membership in Friends of the Cambridge Forum, our support organization. Cambridge Forum has been providing these free public discussions in Harvard Square for 47 years, thanks to the generosity of the Friends of Cambridge Forum. Thank you all very much for the support you've given. You are the supporters. Thanks to the Harvard Bookstore, we have copies of Lester Brown's new book, Breaking New Ground, for sale after the program. And of course, he will be happy to sign a copy for you after the program is over. As our friends are aware, Cambridge Forum is a participatory activity, and the audience assists by asking questions during the discussion portion of the program. We're also a voluntarily funded organization and welcome donations to support our public programs. There is a basket into which you can place generous donations at the table in the vestibule on your way in and on your way out. As you know, Cambridge Forum's public programs are recorded and then edited and produced as half-hour radio programs aired on a nationwide network of national public radio stations. Podcasts of the programs are available if you want to subscribe to our podcasts, and there is a form you can fill out on the same entry table that you pass on the way in. In addition, tonight's program is being videotaped and will be available on YouTube eventually. Because our program is recorded, we ask that you come forward and speak to the microphone in the middle aisle here when you do want to pose your question. And of course, by coming forward to the microphone, you will be giving us your consent to be recorded and perhaps even broadcast or webcast. Finally, we don't really want to record your cell phone ringing, so if you have a cell phone and can turn it to the off position, we've been reliably informed that even turning it to the off position doesn't mean it can't be tapped. And in fact, since Obama seems to have gotten into the practice of listening to people's phone calls these days, you might want to keep it in such a way that he could listen to what's going on here tonight. I mean, he ought to hear it. In any case, we're about to start, so please turn off the ringing portions, maybe on to vibrate or whatever. Thank you very much. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing Breaking New Ground with internationally acclaimed environmental analyst Lester Brown. I'm Tim Weiskell, a member of the Forum's board, and I'll be your moderator this evening. In 1965, Lester Brown accurately predicted a famine in India and proposed a response that would change the face of India's agriculture. This turned out to be his life work, and he spent his 50-plus year career studying the Earth's ecosystems and proposing solutions to looming environmental crises. In his memoir, Breaking New Ground, Lester Brown looks back over his life, beginning with his childhood and the experience he had on his own family farm. What paths did he follow to become a powerful and respected voice for international environmental issues? Has he ever felt like a voice crying in the wilderness of our modern materialistic culture? How has he blended data and science with moral conviction to speak convincingly on questions that take world leaders and ordinary citizens far outside their comfort zones? Author of more than 20 major works, alerting the public to possible environmental problems, Lester Brown is widely recognized as the nation's leading environmental writer. He is the founder of the World Watch and Earth Policy Institutes, which analyze global environmental issues and provide a vision and a roadmap for achieving an environmentally sustainable economy. Lester has received numerous prizes, including the MacArthur Fellowship, the UN Environment Prize, Japan's prestigious Blue Planet Prize, and 25 honorary degrees. In 2012, he was inducted into the Earth Hall of Fame in Kyoto. Welcome, Lester, back to Cambridge Forum.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you all for coming out tonight, especially those of you who are Red Sox fans. I thought I might begin this evening, and we can take it in whatever way we want, but I thought I would talk a bit about food and the changes in the world food situation that we're now experiencing. We're moving into a new era in the world food economy, and it's one that I don't think is widely understood. We're looking at now record growth in the demand for grain. The annual growth in the demand for grain this year will be roughly double what it was a decade ago. We have two major sources of additional demand. One is population growth. That's not new. We've been adding 80 million people a year now for some time. For some decades, in effect. And what this means is that there will be 219,000 people at the dinner table tonight who were not here last night. And tomorrow night, there'll be another 219,000. So the growth in population is relentless. And unfortunately, most of the projected growth in population, the 2 billion that we'll be adding between now and 2050, will be coming in areas where hunger is most prevalent today, namely the Indian subcontinent and sub-Saharan Africa. Most of the 2 billion people to be added will be in these two parts of the world. We see, in addition to population growth, we see rising affluence emerging as a major source of additional demand for grain. And this is most visible in China, partly because of its size and partly because incomes are rising so fast and the Chinese are moving up the food chain. We've never had such a concentrated, rapid movement of people up the food chain, consuming more grain-intensive livestock products. We're looking in China at meat, especially pork, milk, and eggs. And when you get 1.2 billion people moving up the food chain rapidly, it quickly consumes a lot of grain. Just to put this in perspective and look at diets in India and the US, for example. In India, annual grain consumption per person is about 400 pounds, 400 pounds per person per year, which is roughly a pound a day. That's India. In the United States, we consume closer to 1,600 pounds of grain per person per year. Of that, relatively little, maybe 150, 200 pounds is consumed as bread, pastries, breakfast cereals. Most of that 1,600 pounds is consumed indirectly in the form of meat, milk, eggs, cheese, yogurt, all those things you see when you open your refrigerator. So we've moved up the food chain, and with China now moving up the food chain at an extraordinary rate, we're seeing the world demand for grain respond to that. So we have population growth, we have rising affluence, and in this country we have the extensive use of grain to fuel cars. We harvest each year about 400 million tons of grain in the United States. Of that, roughly 130 million tons is going to ethanol distilleries to produce fuel for cars. So it's a substantial chunk of our total grain production. Fortunately, we have a very productive agriculture. In the U.S. Midwest, we have some of the finest agricultural real estate in the world. Just to put that in perspective, the state of Iowa produces more grain than Canada, while at the same time producing more soybeans than China. That's a double wow. The U.S. state of Iowa producing more grain than China and more grain than Canada and more soybeans than China. So we have a very strong agricultural base, and this is why we are far and away the world's leading exporter of grain. In expanding the supply of food, we're running into some new problems. We have some old constraints and we have some new ones. The newest one is hitting what I call the glass ceiling on grain yields. We've been raising grain yields, well, the Japanese started a century and a half ago, been raising grain yields a long time. But in Japan, beginning about 15, 17 years ago, the rise in grain yields came to a halt and they plateaued. And regardless of the price of rice in Japan, Japanese farmers haven't been able to break through that glass ceiling. What's happening now that's interesting and even more important is that rice yields in China have caught up, or almost caught up within about 4% of rice yields in Japan. And unless Chinese farmers can outperform their counterparts in Japan, their grain yields are going to plateau as well. And I don't think they can. So we're looking at two important rice-growing countries, including China, by far the biggest in the world, where grain yields are either have or are about to plateau. We're seeing the same thing with wheat. If we look at Europe, for example, wheat yields in France plateaued more than a decade ago. Same thing in the UK, same thing has happened in Germany. It's not that farmers in those countries wouldn't like to further raise grain yields, or wheat yields in this case, but they can't. They've sort of hit the glass ceiling. I calculate that roughly 40% of the world's grain is now produced in countries that have hit this glass ceiling. So it's becoming more difficult to rapidly expand world grain production at a time when demand is growing at a record pace. The result, not surprising, is rising grain prices. World grain prices today are roughly double what they were 7 years ago, and they're going to keep going up. In addition to the glass ceiling, we are now seeing the emergence of water shortages as probably the principal constraint on expanding, the principal and most imminent constraint on efforts to expand grain production. We've been expanding irrigation for a long time, but within the last 2 or 3 years, we appear to have reached peak water, peak irrigation water. And that is now beginning to come down. In the U.S., the irrigated area is shrinking. In the western Great Plains, we've had land irrigated in Texas, northern Texas, Oklahoma, southern Kansas, with water from the Ogallala Aquifer. That aquifer is a fossil aquifer. That is, it does not recharge. So when you're pumping that, when you eventually pump it, if you pump it long enough, it will go dry. And the wells are already starting to go dry with the Ogallala Aquifer because there's no recharge. The other large fossil aquifer in the world is also in a strategically important place, which is under the North China Plain. The Chinese have been irrigating heavily from their deep aquifer, which is the fossil aquifer, and it too is being depleted, and we're beginning to see the shrinkage of cultivation in parts of China that are dependent on that particular aquifer. In addition to the glass ceiling and the emerging constraints of water on efforts to expand grain production, we also have soil erosion becoming a serious problem in some parts of the world. One part is in western China. And it's not from overplowing so much as it is overgrazing. The U.S. and China have similar grazing capacities. Each country has close to 100 million head of cattle. The U.S. has 9 million sheep and goats. China has 282 million sheep and goats. And they cannot sustain that population. In western China, this huge population of sheep and goats, western and northern China, this huge population of sheep and goats is simply destroying the vegetation. And the government is not strong enough to intervene and impose limits on the size of these flocks of sheep and goats in the villages. So we're just watching this unfold. We're seeing a dust bowl created in western China that is dwarfing the dust bowl we had in this country during the 1930s. We got our dust bowl under control, we stabilized things, but there's no prospect in the foreseeable future that the Chinese will be able to get this huge dust bowl under control. The other region of the world where there's a huge dust bowl developing is in the Sahelian region of Africa. The population in sub-Saharan Africa, the human population is growing very rapidly, and the livestock population more or less tracks the growth in the human population because these are rural societies, and the more people there are, the more sheep and goats. So we're seeing a dust bowl forming all the way across Africa from Senegal to Somalia. Huge dust storms coming out of that region, and no prospect of getting the situation under control that we can see in the foreseeable future, partly because so many governments are involved. It's very difficult to work this out administratively. And then we have climate change. We've had, as one who was farming 50, 60 years ago, we had to deal with the vagaries of weather. One year we might have a heat wave that would damage crops. Another year maybe an extended drought. But we always knew that things would go back to normal. But today, there is no norm to go back to. The climate system is in a state of flux. Agriculture, as we know it today, was designed to maximize production with a climate system that had been remarkably stable over an 11,000-year period. But now, that's beginning to change. And with each passing year, the agricultural system and the climate system are more and more out of sync with each other. And it's hard for us to deal with that because we don't know what's happening with the climate well enough to anticipate the changes and to integrate the appropriate shifts in agriculture. So we're sort of caught off base with this, and it's going to be a costly one. I mean, we know from experience to date that a 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature leads to roughly a 10% decline in grain yields. Some recent research out of Stanford says that it could be as high as 16%, a 16% decline in yields for a 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature. But this is making it more difficult for farmers to keep up with the record growth in demand. When I was in the Department of Agriculture, late 50s and much of the 60s, whenever there was a tight food supply around the world, we would simply release idled cropland in the United States. The big problem in those days was surpluses. And so in this country, we paid farmers not to produce. It might be 12% of the land, might be 15% of the land, maybe even more, depending on the world grain balance. But then we gradually have moved out of the surplus situation. There are no huge stocks of unneeded grain in the world today. Indeed, with climate change, we should have larger reserves than we used to have, but our reserves are actually smaller today than they were, say, a couple of decades ago. A half-century ago, food security was the responsibility of the Department of Agriculture in Washington, and we had the resources, we had the policies, we had the knowledge and understanding of world agriculture, and we could do what was needed to maintain a certain level of food security in the world. But now that's beginning to change. Decisions made in the Department of Energy in Washington, or indeed anywhere in the world, may have a greater effect on food security than those made in the Ministry of Agriculture. And this is new. Suddenly, food security depends on energy policy as well as agricultural policy. The bottom line here is that we need to restructure the world energy economy. We need to shift from an economy that relies primarily on fossil fuels, indeed, I should say overwhelmingly on fossil fuels, to one that is powered by renewable sources of energy. Wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, probably some tidal, but wind and solar are the big ones. And we have to think about efficiency. We're seeing, for the first time, some enormous growth in wind energy generation in the world. And the big player is China. China now has under construction 7 wind mega complexes that will have a minimum of 20,000 megawatts of generating capacity each. To put that in perspective, that's equal to 20 nuclear power plants or large coal generating complexes. 7 wind mega complexes, at least 20,000 megawatts each. The largest of these will be in Inner Mongolia. It is scheduled to have 38,000 megawatts of wind generating capacity when it's completed. To put that in perspective, that wind farm will generate enough electricity to satisfy the needs of a country like Poland. So this is huge. We've not seen thinking, investing, planning in the energy sector on this scale before. A large coal-generating facility, maybe 1,000 megawatts, but not 20,000 megawatts. So China is moving boldly into the lead with wind energy, and one of the reasons, obviously, they're worried about air pollution, and they're worried about political unrest from people who are affected by some of the worst air pollution that's ever been recorded. I mean, you see things like life expectancy being reduced by 5.5 years because of air pollution in parts of China. So it's a real issue for them. And we're now looking at solar cells in a situation that is becoming both interesting and exciting. In this country, the growth in rooftop solar cell installations, mostly for residents, but increasingly for retailers and industrial firms and so forth. Walmart, for example, is in the process of installing huge numbers of solar cells on their rooftops to supply power. But the interesting thing that's happening is that as solar installations are put on rooftops, residential, for example, as that number increases, it reduces the market for utility-generated electricity. So as the cost of solar cells comes down and solar generation expands at an accelerating rate, the utilities must still maintain their structures, their distribution systems. But their market for electricity is shrinking, so they have to raise prices. As they raise prices, it accelerates the investment in solar cells. So we have this very interesting situation where the utilities are sort of trapped, and there's no easy way out for them unless they also begin investing in solar generation, which is what they should be doing if they're at all forward-looking in their planning. So we're seeing some entirely new situations develop in the energy sector. We're also seeing lifestyle changes, reducing the demand for energy. One of the most interesting ones is happening in this country now, and we see it particularly with automobiles. Young people are not buying cars the way my generation did, for example. When I was growing up, you reached 17 and getting a driver's license and something to drive was a rite of passage. I mean, especially in the rural community in which I lived, but more broadly, everyone wanted to get a driver's license. That's not the case anymore. Young people are simply not buying cars at the rate that our generation did. The folks at NASCAR discovered this not too long ago. Someone pointed out that if you look at photographs of the people in the stands who go to NASCAR races, it's mostly white hair. There are no young people. I say no, there are not very many young people there. Young people are not into racing. They're not even particularly interested in owning cars. So we're seeing a cultural shift that is beginning to affect the use of energy. We're also seeing the emergence of bike sharing programs. As I recall, by the end of this year in this country, we will have close to 100 bike share programs, cities with bike share programs. Washington, interestingly, has been the leading city in developing a bike share program. Of course, we haven't done much else in Washington lately, so we could be working. We're at least doing this. I think we must now have close to 100 bike racks in Washington, D.C., a few thousand bicycles, and they're being used. So we're seeing, and associated with that has been an effort by the D.C. government working with Maryland and Virginia in the suburbs to create a bike-friendly environment. Bike trails, bike lanes, et cetera, and beginning to connect them so they're part of a larger Washington network. Bike sharing is catching on very fast. We're beginning to see universities adopt bike share programs for student body use, and a number of cities New York has recently launched a bike share program. I was in New York, I think it was last week, going down the street and saw a bike rack with 50 bikes in it on the street. It was one of the cross streets, I've forgotten, 54th Street or something. And it was just amazing to see so many bikes available for use in New York City. So there's some exciting things happening, like the shift from cars to bicycle among younger people in this country. The challenge is to restructure the energy economy quickly. We don't have a lot of time. In fact, time is probably our scarcest resource. We know what needs to be done. We're beginning to do it. We're seeing some encouraging signs with bike sharing and closing coal-fired power plants. I think the Sierra Club just a week or so ago announced that they had closed their 150th coal plant over the last 3 years since they launched their Beyond Coal campaign. That still leaves us with, 480 coal plants yet to close, but they've made a good start, and their goal is to close every one. They have a very clear goal, and I think they will do it. It'll still take some years yet, but we're moving in the right direction. I could go on for some time, but Tim, this may be enough to set the stage. I know the autobiography is about me, but I think these issues are more important. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay. You're joining us at the Cambridge Forum, listening to Lester Brown discussing his autobiography and other things. His autobiography is called Breaking New Ground. I'm curious and would like to pose the question to you a little bit in the vein of the autobiography of how it was that you got onto these global issues to begin with. It seems to me you write very compellingly about your early experience on a farm and then your movement very quickly at a rather young age to viewing the circumstances of farmers in India, then coming back to the States to try to make sense of that in some way. Would you like to outline for us, just briefly, the importance of that India moment in your early focus upon agricultural issues?
I'm not entirely sure where the global range of interest and orientation came from in the early years, but growing up on a farm, and since neither of my parents had graduated from elementary school, we didn't have dinner discussions about world affairs, sorts of things. So I found myself reading extensively, maybe even voraciously, and particularly biography and history and these sorts of things. There were two scientists, for example, that impressed me rather strongly with their achievements. One was Marie Curie, Marie Sklodowska-Curie, a Polish woman who had to come to Paris to go to graduate school, and George Washington Carver, extraordinarily creative scientist. But books probably, during these early years, books of biography and history particularly, probably shaped my thinking and my orientation, my interests more than anything else. The other thing, of course, is growing up on a farm, which in itself is an educational experience. Those of us have grown up on farms and obviously had to work from an early age, and particularly with general farms where you have cows and pigs and chickens and grow cash crops like tomatoes and peppers and so forth, along with feed crops. It was just an extraordinarily educational system or situation. And so when I learned that there was a program where young American farmers would be sent to other countries to live in particularly developing countries, but also in industrial countries, including those in Europe. I decided to apply for it, and much to my surprise, I was told that I would be had been nominated to go to India and live in villages there. I mean, if you look at the economic spectrum, it's difficult to find two countries further apart at that time than the United States and India. But it was just a rich experience in terms of meeting people and understanding and being part of a family in the village, working in the rice paddies, for example, and getting a sense of what life what the agricultural life in the third world village was like. So I was just very fortunate that someone decided that I was selected to as one of 10 young American farmers to go to India.
Well, in coming back from that experience, you made more of it than most people. For one thing, you started keeping figures in a way. In other words, you started to add things up. You started to see how much grain was available. One of the striking things in your book is the description of the difference of experience in India itself between different kinds of farmers. And you saw, in some cases, families that weren't eating 3 meals a day, couldn't eat 3 meals a day. There was no food available for it. And when you came back, it seems to me you made more use of that sense of urgency than many others, casual observers, would have. And having come from a farming background, you knew what needed to be mobilized quickly. It's to the great fortune of many Indians, but also to the world in general, that you acted very quickly in 1965, in fact, just before 1965. Do you want to give us a sense of what the urgency was that you felt at that point?
After living in villages in India, I developed, not surprisingly, a strong interest in world agriculture. I wanted to know world agriculture and to know it well, better than anyone. So I ended up joining the Foreign Agricultural Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. But before that, as I mentioned earlier, I was nominated to go to India and live in villages. And I remember one particular situation, and I described this in the book, where in southern India, an English-speaking person I got to know in the village agreed to take me on a tour, an unscheduled tour of some villages, and the idea was we would go at lunchtime because I wanted to see what people were eating. And what we discovered was that almost no one was eating lunch in India. They may have had 2 meals a day, something in the morning and something at night, but nothing in between. And in some families, there was only 1 meal. And we didn't go to the best homes in the village. We just went where most of the Indian people were living. And it was this experience living in the villages in 1956 that sort of stimulated my interest in world agriculture and led me in early 1959 to join the Foreign Agricultural Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And I joined the Asia branch, which was fortuitous in many ways, and was working there, and was also had become. Well, I was in the Asia branch. This is kind of another story, and their branch chief called me in one day. This was after I'd taken a year here at the Kennedy School. This would have been what was then the Littauer School of Public Administration. I came back, and he thought it would be great if we did some projections for Asia, because this was a populous part of the world. There were large markets developing there for U.S. farm products. He thought we should know more about it. And he was right. But I said, you can't do projections for Asia unless you know what's happening in the rest of the world, because you won't know for sure if commodities will be flowing into that region or out of that region. Well, we were the Asia branch. We couldn't do that. So he then, the next week, he called me in again. He said, we really need to do some projections for Asia. So we had a replay of exactly the same discussion. So then the next week, he called me in again, and he changed the question. He said, could you do projections for the world? I said, sure. And he said, okay. This was June. He said, you've got 6 months. He said, I'll provide cover for you. So I did. Produced something called Man, Land, and Food, looking at world food needs, which was the first systematic projections of world food supply and demand to the end of the century. I had the advantage that the United Nations in 1957 had done the first world population projections to the end of the century. So we had new data on the demand side that could be used in these projections. So I got the study completed, and it was approved by our branch chief, but because it had the word man in it, as in population, and no one in government even talked about population in those days, it was a no-no. But we had it scheduled for release in November of 1963. And I had called a reporter at U.S. News and World Report because I wanted to make sure someone knew about the study and it just didn't disappear. And he was interested. So the next week he came again to discuss this, but brought his editor. And they were interested in doing something, and it was scheduled for something like November 26, 1963. And then I think it was on November 23rd, Kennedy was assassinated. So that issue was torn up and they started all over again. I mean, it was so I sort of forgot this. And then in January 6, 1942, in 1964, U.S. News and World Report did a cover story on this study, 4 pages, and laying out the projections and sort of emphasizing why food was, the cover said why food to be world's #1 problem. So that was sort of how my early interest in agriculture, the experience in India, all sort of came together to do these first world supply and demand projections. Sometimes what we do is influenced more by luck than anything else. I think it was Vince Lombardi who said, you can never tell which way the ball is going to bounce, but if you're ready, when it bounces, you can grab it. And in a sense, there was an opportunity for advancing our knowledge with some long-term supply and demand projections, and I was challenged by it and did Man, Land, and Food.
Very good. Thank you. You're listening to Cambridge Forum, and we continue our discussion with your questions. Please come to the center aisle to pose your questions to Lester Brown.
Here in New England, we're experiencing quite a revolution at the grassroots level in the area of local food and farming and direct sales and a great deal of activity that's largely out of the formal system, but is beginning to represent a good deal of food movement into retail stores, into restaurants, but particularly into residences and so forth all across the region. I'd like to know what your reaction is to that, what I would call revolution in local food and farming. And also, since you are a graduate of a land-grant university, Rutgers, if you feel that there is much chance or much hope that the American land-grant university system will return to its earlier roots and serve this kind of a system to a much greater degree than it has been in recent decades. Thank you.
We have seen in recent years a spreading interest in local agriculture, and one of the sort of manifestations of this is farmers markets. There are, gosh, I'm trying to remember the latest compilation at USDA. I think there's something like 1,200 farmers markets now in the United States, most of which have sprung up over the last several years. They still represent only a small, a few percent of U.S. food consumption, but they're growing. And there are a number of interesting things about it. One is on the supply side, people are returning to the soil and producing on a local scale for a local market. And it's partly a response to getting produce in the supermarket that comes from California or Mexico or someplace, and it's not very fresh when we finally get it. So there's a desire for freshness in food. There's also what I would call sort of underpinning this kind of a return to the land movement. People find a certain satisfaction in growing products themselves and being able to share them in market, share them with neighbors, market in local markets. I view it as a very encouraging development and sort of in a sense, a humanizing of what has become a very large-scale, commercially oriented agricultural sector.
First is that although Iowa may be an agricultural powerhouse, it comes at great expense both in terms of fossil fuels and in terms of biodiversity. The state is essentially dead biologically with very few birds, essentially no worms, and dung beetles are all gone. Essentially the soil life that's responsible for both extracting the nutrients from the ground and responsible for sequestering carbon are no longer present. So the ecological system is completely disrupted.
Just a little bit louder.
I'm sorry, I'm just saying that the ecological system is completely disrupted from the soil on up. The question that I had is that everyone agrees that overgrazing is terribly destructive to land. There are any number of studies now pointing to the benefits of planned restorative grazing. Most recently, Nature Conservancy, just this most recent issue, and the cover story, it was about a 3 million acre restoration going on in Patagonia using sheep. And I don't want anyone to be left with the notion that it's simply the number of the size of the herd that is causing the destruction, but rather the way that the animals are managed. And in fact, this own country, many of us now believe in the climate community, would do better to breed up and to use greater number of animals to restore the land, to capture the carbon, to restore the water tables, and so forth. I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on how these new counterintuitive ideas can be brought further into the climate discussion. Thank you.
If you follow the literature in this field, in recent years we've seen the emergence of a number of new trends. The idea of rotational grazing, for example, the interest in locally produced food, concerns about nutrition when foods are shipped long distances and so forth. And as you mentioned, where you have extreme commercialization, there's often extraordinary loss of biological diversity. And the question, one of the questions we face now is with the population as large as it is, and with the demands on the land being as great as they are, I think we've lost some of the options that we once had. Let me give an example of that. With urbanization, we have totally disrupted the nutrient cycle in agriculture. When I was growing up on the farm, all the manure from the dairy barn, the pig pens, the chicken houses, everything went back on the land. But now we have sort of the urban equivalent of, with cattle, of huge numbers concentrated in feedlots, and then they become waste problems, and the runoff becomes, creates dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico or off the east coast of the United States, or the east coast of China, for that matter. These are difficult issues, and we're not close to addressing them at the national level or at the international level. We need some rethinking about the nutrient cycle, because we've so totally disrupted it, and it becomes a problem on both ends, whether it's the Bay of Tokyo or the Gulf of the United States. We have these huge dead zones now developing because of excessive nutrient runoff. And there's no sort of easy way of getting at these issues. We are a highly urbanized society now. In this country, I think 82%. So we have the nutrient cycle problem in spades here, and we're not beginning to deal with it. We're not thinking in terms of nutrient cycle. Urban waste managers are thinking of how to get rid of the waste as cheaply and easily as possible without thinking about the nutrient cycle at all. And we don't have the leadership on these issues to deal with this. I could go on for a bit, but let's try another question.
Thank you. My name's Sean Paul, and my question has to do with your comments on energy and where we're headed and what's achievable. And I just, to give context, today I'm very excited that I completed putting solar on my roof of my home. And I learned we can all do it here in New England, to my surprise. But it was only possible in part because there were tax incentives in place and incentives that made that achievable economically, both for the company that put it on there and for me as a homeowner. I now work with an investor group. We're really excited about renewable energy opportunities and energy entrepreneurs, but it's very dependent on tax incentives and financial structures. So my question to you, what's achievable in the next, 5 years in terms of redefining our energy future that still seems very dependent on the role of government?
I would come back to the example I used earlier with a growing number of homes like yours with solar installations on the rooftop to provide electricity. And as I mentioned, the exciting thing is this sort of feedback loop where you have the cost of solar installations going down. It's true that tax incentives have been a key to this, but they're continuing to come down. And with your rooftop solar installation reducing the market for the utility in this area, they're having to raise prices, or if they haven't, they will. And so then we begin to see, it's almost like a seesaw. Suddenly it shifts and everything changes. And at some point we won't need the tax incentives anymore. The economic forces, the market forces will be strong enough to drive the process. And that's sort of the history of new technologies. I mean, many of the technologies we use today originated with the Department of Defense and R&D programs there. And they were funded by taxpayers, and then they became commercial. I mean, the whole computer revolution had its origins with defense expenditures, for example. So we're beginning to see potentially rapid change in the energy sector, unlike anything we've seen before, whether it's solar energy in the United States for the reasons I mentioned, or whether it's wind farms in China, partly because of concerns about air pollution. So there are a lot of forces at work now driving us toward new energy. I mentioned the bicycle thing. I mean, that's replacing fossil fuel energy with biochemical energy, which most of us have in excess anyhow. We need to be burning more energy. So bikes satisfy that need nicely. So a lot of social and economic forces are at work in beginning to drive the change in this field. But I think we're going to see a lot of change in a short period of time.
Hi, I've been following your work for a number of years, so I'm delighted that you're here today.
Thank you.
Places like Whole Foods and other grocery markets are distributing more organic food, but in terms of convenience-based dining, whether it's fast food or casual dining, there's very few healthy and organic options. And I'm just wondering, what do you think it will take to tip the balance towards more consumers wanting to eat and live healthy? And then a follow-up to that is, what is your assessment of the current U.S. seal for organic foods? Is it sufficient or not?
The U.S.
The government standard for certifying organic foods, is it adequate?
I don't know enough about the last one to answer that. On the first question, the chains are moving ahead because it may be easier for consumers to express their preferences at this level, because each consumer buys a lot of dollars worth of produce with each visit, whereas with fast food, there's not so much labeling in fast food, I don't think, so people don't know so much about that. And I don't know, I think it's going to be difficult for fast foods to invade, for organic foods to invade the fast food world. Just by its nature, it's people who want food in a hurry, and they want it cheap, and they want it to be tasty. And whether that segment of our population would support organic produce is a bit of a question. It would support it strongly is a bit of a question in my mind.
Hi, I've got so many different questions about the things that you talked about. But first, I'm just going to make a comment that maybe biking is becoming more popular.
A little louder.
Popular around here in the little bubble of Massachusetts and Washington, D.C., but in India and in China, they're trying to get rid of the bikes on the roads because they want more room for the cars. So that's going the opposite way. That's just a comment. My question is, since I was a teenager, I've known about the aquifer. I can't pronounce it, the
Ogallala?
Yeah, and the problems with that. And doesn't seem like anything's being done. Now, I live here, I don't live there, but my impression is there's not a lot of conservation going on, and there's not a lot of even awareness that this is such a huge issue, and that there's just a lot of waste still going on. And I'm wondering if you see any hope there, or who's working on this, and what's going to happen.
It's interesting to look at water against the backdrop of energy, for example. With energy, we realized, 30, 40 years ago when oil prices took off, that we had to begin thinking about efficiency and reducing demand. And we've had some success in reducing, particularly in the last decade or so, in reducing gasoline use in the United States. It's coming down steadily, and that's an encouraging sign. With the Ogallala, obviously, when you have a fixed supply of something you're drawing down, you want to use it as efficiently as possible and stretch its use out as far as you can. But it's like pumping oil. There's no replacement, and once you've pumped a well, an oil field dry essentially, the game's over, and that's the way it's going to be with the Ogallala. And that's the way it's going to be with the deep aquifer under the North China Plain, because there's no recharge there. So once you can decide to pump it, but once you've pumped it dry, then irrigated agriculture comes to an end. And that's just a reality. Now we can think about the efficiency of water use. We know that drip irrigation is the most efficient, though not always the most economic. Sprinkler irrigation is better than furrow irrigation. We also know that some crops use a lot more water than others. For example, it takes twice as much water to produce a ton of rice as it does a ton of wheat. So maybe we should be gradually shifting our diet away from rice and toward wheat. And indeed, that is happening in some places. It's happening in Egypt, for example, just to cite a sizable country where we're seeing a shift in production patterns because of water constraints. So there are things we can do. And of course, anytime you move down the food chain, that reduces the demand for water as well. And in this country, it would be good for us in health terms to move down the food chain, as well as for the health of the planet.
So so nobody's doing anything about the Ogallala, whatever that, it seems like people know that there's going to be a problem, but nobody's doing anything to avert this catastrophe, or are they? The
state governments have begun to address this and to encourage the more efficient use of water. They've begun to actually calculate the amount of water in the Ogallala in western Kansas, for example, and to make this information available to farmers. Farmers are organizing, and they're trying to figure out how to best manage this diminishing resource. They know eventually it's going to be gone, and then the question, what are the economics of using it up as quickly as possible versus stretching it out over time? So they are thinking about these issues, but it's not a question of whether we can save the Ogallala or not. It will eventually disappear. And the question is, how can we get the most out of the water that's in that deposit before it's all gone?
My wife and I followed all your wonderful publications, but we're very aware that we kind of live in the Cambridge bubble. And so my question to you is, since I'm now at the age where I'm being approached by everything from Harvard to Nature Conservancy to NRDC and so forth, since I'm retired, what's the most effective place to give dollars to accelerate this, to give you a megaphone, or to give some organization a megaphone so that more people become aware of this? Any ideas?
Well, you could start with the Earth Policy Institute. No, I'm kidding. When I look at groups that are being most effective, I'm impressed right now with what the Sierra Club is doing with its Beyond Coal campaign. It is closing coal-fired power plants. That's the reality. And it plans, its goal, which I like clear goals. And the idea they plan to close every coal plant in the United States is a very clear goal. Everyone can understand that. So Sierra would be one, obviously, but Sierra is a big organization with 1.2 million members or something, so your contribution might not make as much difference there. If I were looking for a place where I could get the most return on the dollar in terms of making a difference, I'd probably be looking at some of the population groups, Population Connection, International Planned Parenthood. These are groups actually working to make a difference on the population issue, and I happen to think it's one of the key issues, and one that doesn't get very much attention. You and I have been talking about it tonight, but you don't hear much on the news, for example, about what's happening with population, in various places in the world. No one seems to want to talk about it anymore. But it is real, and there are 80 million more people each year in the world. And I've talked about feeding them, but there are other needs as well, whether it's housing or water or land or whatever.
Thank you.
Good evening. Last night at the Kennedy School, the chairman of the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission spoke, and he told me, which was a surprise, that originally his role for Wall Street grew out of the agricultural market futures regarding grain. Can you give some perspective on what the original use of options and futures trading was in agriculture, and then how it's grown into the problem of worldwide speculation regarding commodities, and how much of a large effect that has today?
I have not really thought a lot about this issue, but I can say that investment, which was concentrated in commodity, is now shifting toward resources like land, and particularly land with water. So land and water are becoming valuable resources. And if someone has done a land value index, and I think over the last 7 years, or roughly, the value of land in the world has doubled. I mean, that's in the U.S. Midwest, it's in Argentina, Brazil, Asia. Land values are going up, and we're seeing large investments. You may have caught not too many weeks ago that the Chinese have bought or leased for the next 50 years 7 million acres of land in the Ukraine. 7 million acres. That's bigger than New Jersey. So it's a very sizable thing, and we're going to see more of this. China feels very vulnerable on the food front because of their huge population, people wanting to move up the food chain, and the government is politically not that strong. The Communist Party has maybe 30 million members out of 1.3 billion or whatever. So it's a challenge, and I've said earlier that land is becoming the new oil, food is the new gold, and increasingly investors are seeing it in these terms. And it represents a realization in the investment community that we are living on a finite planet, and there are limits to the Earth's resources, whether it's water or land or what have you. And for a long time, some of us have been talking about the constraints and the limits of resources, go all the way back to the limits of growth in 1972. But investors didn't respond to that study and say, oh, we've got to, land is going to be valuable. Now they can see why land and water are, the new oil, the new gold sort of thing.
Thank you so much. Since we're in church, would you like to prophesy what will happen in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years?
Would you like to prophesy? He said, since we're in church, would you like to prophesy? In other words, give a projection, what you think may be happening in 10, 20, 30 years.
As I look at our future, I think food is the weak link in the system. I think it's where all the trends that we're concerned about sort of converge during this decade. Climate change, water shortages, growing population and mounting pressure on the Earth's land and water resources. I haven't talked about forests and grasslands, but the same thing is happening there. All the natural systems, forests, grasslands, fisheries, are faced with excessive pressure. and they're beginning to weaken and to become less productive in some cases. Now, sometimes you can offset that. Fish farming has really caught on in China. 40 million tons of seafood being produced a year now, as I recall. The world fish catch is only 90 million tons. So we're seeing things like this happen on a scale we couldn't have imagined a few years back. But my bottom line prophecy is that food is the weak link, and if I were to pick one indicator that I think will tell us more about our future than any other, it would be the world price of grain.
I'd like to pull you back a little bit to your autobiography. You've been doing this work now for more than 50 years. You've been analyzing ecological issues, and you've been proposing potential solutions. Could you tell us what you think your biggest success was and what your biggest failure was?
What's society's biggest success and failure, or my biggest success and failure?
Your biggest success and failure in getting your analysis out there and acted upon.
That's what I was afraid you had said. I guess maybe...
I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but...
The general idea that we were faced with tightening resources and that at some point the tightening could lead to its own set of problems is one that's not unique to me. It goes back to the limits to growth, and even before that, the limits to growth was 1972. When the limits to growth came out, that set of projections saying that we're going to run into resource problems in the next 30, 40 years was kind of, by the business community, totally dismissed. They said, it won't happen. We have advancing technology now, and there'll be technological solutions to all these problems. Don't worry about it. But in fact, the solutions aren't coming very fast, and there are problems for which there are not easy technological solutions. A lot of the problems we face now require behavioral change. If we're going to stabilize climate, that's going to take an enormous change in human behavior. If I were to look at successes, I think the awareness that exists today about climate change, for example, represents progress. It's not that everyone is worried about climate change, but more and more people are. And it takes time for these issues to reach the point where they create tipping points in behavior. We see changes in behavior, as I mentioned, with bicycles, for example, a real change in attitude. Every mayor in the country of the top 100 cities either has something underway in this field or is working on it, because it is being seen as a way of helping to deal with many of the problems we face, from traffic congestion to air pollution to lack of exercise and so forth. I mean, the bicycle is the right technology at the right time, so it's getting support today that we couldn't have imagined 5 years ago, for example. So that would be an example of success story. The fact that we have a combination of things actually leading to a decline in carbon emissions in this country, whether it's partly more efficient cars, it's partly closing coal-fired power plants, these things coming together so we reverse this historical trend of rising CO2 emissions in this country. It's now coming down. That's a major success story. It's not just we've slowed the rise, we've actually reversed it and are reducing carbon emissions each year. That's progress. It's not moving fast enough yet, but at least we've got it moving in the right direction and at a meaningful pace.
I'm going to follow up with a slightly different question. When Sean Paul asked you about his the tax incentives that were supporting his ability to put on solar panels, he seemed to wonder whether it was a good thing that government and tax policy were involved in promoting this change. What do you see as the role of government in promoting the changes that are necessary?
Most of the new technologies that have influenced and reshaped our lives in recent decades began with government. Jet aircraft, for example, were developed by the U.S. government, and then were commercialized. And now it's the government's not in the business of making jet aircraft anymore. And so government has a role in starting things. Computers, the computer revolution that we look at today had its root in the military, way back. And then it gradually developed and advanced to the point where it suddenly took off on its own, and no one even thinks about subsidizing computers anymore, for example. It's there. That, I think, is the role of government, to help get things started. And that's true in agriculture with new varieties, for example. Individual farmers don't have the resources themselves to develop better varieties of their crops, but governments do, both the federal government and the state government. The whole land grant system has been, I think, an extraordinary success. As I recall, the land grant bill was signed by President Lincoln in 1866 or so. When was it?
It was earlier. It was during the Civil War.
It was during the Civil War. Okay.
1862.
Thank you. 1862. But when you look at what has been accomplished in the land grant colleges as a system, it's extraordinary, and it's been one of the keys to our emergence as the world's leading food producer and exporter, for example. Made a huge contribution. So government, I'll give another example, and this goes back to my alma mater, Rutgers. With a lot of state and federal support, as land grant schools get, in the late 30s, early 40s, the soil science department at Rutgers developed antibiotics. They discovered aureomycin, neomycin, streptomycin, the list were a product of the soil science department at Rutgers. Now, the value to the university, of course, was as these were commercialized, there was a huge flow of royalties for the next 17 years. But it's an example of a soil science department supported by both state and federal governments, and a land grant university producing antibiotics that literally revolutionized world medicine. And when you think about it, what an extraordinary return in terms of improvements in human health and longevity and so forth that began in the soil science department of Rutgers, but with state and federal funding.
Well, thank you very much, Lester Brown.
Thank you for coming. You have been listening to Cambridge Forum.
Co-sponsored by the First Parish Church in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For more information about this program entitled Breaking New Ground, recorded in October 2013, featuring Lester Brown, or for more information about the program, visit us on the web at cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Tim Weiskell. Thank you very much for joining us. Cambridge Forum's next public program takes place on Wednesday, November 13th, when we host author and musician Stephen Wade, discussing the award-winning new book, The Beautiful Music All Around Us. Wade has spent a decade tracking down the musicians featured in the field recordings in the 1930s and 1940s, and his book paints a rich picture of their place in the American experience. The program is here in the parlor at First Parish Church at 7 p.m. I hope you can join us then. Now, for those of you who want books, please make a line.